people have to say free or not. So thinking about accelerating sustainability in clothing, fashion, and apparel, it really is a wicked problem of significant scale. The level of complexity of the fashion, clothing, apparel system is quite significant. And really, to start to understand a lot of the issues, one almost needs to break it down into parts and subsystems. And some of where the change may emerge is actually in those different subsystems, where there's the hotspots. So, so to identify where the change may need to happen, or the innovation may be in parts of the system. So, the reality of the sector is it's an economic powerhouse. It's one of the major global sectors, and it's driven by a number of major brands, but also, like in many sectors, there are many micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, and often that are with craft-based skills, craft-based design and making skills, that produce in job or batch volume. And a lot of the outsourced factories are often in Asia and employing many, hundreds or if not thousands of people. And you have this sort of contract manufacturing where some of these factories may be producing for many people. And despite, we'll come on to that, a lot of issues about the emergence of new technology in the sector, often it's manual labor with people operating machines of some description, rather than the use of robotics or other so-called Industry 4.0 technologies. So one of the issues for me, and whilst I have a sort of 30-year experience in business sustainability from a variety of different aspects, and we have sort of delved into the clothing apparel sector, from time to time, what really actually came out to me in my deep dive into the sector, if you like, was how linear the clothing sector is. Really, it is literally take, make, waste sector. High volumes of waste produced, both in terms of production waste, overproduction, the whole issue of returns, which then may have, may just be simple returns that then can go to waste or not reused in any form. Then the whole issue of stored end of first use waste as well. Many items sitting in people's wardrobes that are just, just sitting there and metaphorically collecting dust. We also heard in terms of one of the presentations that the production waste in terms of offcuts is obviously often quite a significant cost to the business, but it's sort of accepted as a cost rather than something about trying to develop a leaner, notional zero waste production processes. So very significant levels of waste in the sector, and some of that relates to a number of other aspects, perhaps, that we'll come back to. But the sector, also sits across other significant environmental impacts in terms of, for example, approximately 10% of global CO2 emissions. Significant issues in terms of water pollution, particularly in terms of river pollution, in some of those outsourced factories in Asia, and obviously in the whole area of chemical use. And we've seen various NGO activities in terms of trying to reduce chemical use, that have heightened action or heightened some of the brands to take greater action. But we've still got issues and it was elaborated again, going back to the waste side, in that still there is a lack of authoritative data on the extent of the environmental impacts, and particularly waste. And we can see quite significant variations in the figures that are used. So we've also got issues around, one of the other issues quite strongly came out was the whole issue of the social dimension, ethics and equality. And really a lot of the drivers, in the area have been much more focused on indices and tools, focused on the environmental impacts of the industry. And, during the COVID crisis, the social dimension of sustainability, health, has actually come out more strongly, social, community, health. And I believe myself as a sort of observer of things over the years, we're just, entering a fifth green consumer wave that's actually, it sort of started before the pandemic with the whole sort of Greta Thunberg effect around climate change and youth moving into the area. You almost, it seems so long ago, the street protests around the world. But I think this next wave is going to be, yes, it's going to be about climate change, but I think waste is going to be in there, health, social dimensions. I think there's also a lot of people questioning their lives, and I think the whole area of purpose, seems to be emerging a lot more. So I think there is, plenty of, so really there's a lack of these indices and tools to measure the social dimensions of the clothing, apparel, and fashion sector. And perhaps there's a gap there. We heard about Kering's environmental profit and loss account, but what about a social profits and loss account? And we certainly can draw down from the Sustainable Development Goals a number of potential indicators that could form the basis of some sort of social indices there. But we also got wider issues to do with ethics, what is right and wrong, access, fairness, what's a fair wage, issues to do with working conditions, in those outsourced factories. And again, that's also, that sort of complexity is added by some of the nuanced issues around the cultural dimensions of working in different cultures. So the fifth area I'd sort of pulled out in terms of learnings was really this sort of policy dimension and the whole issue of policy development, market transformation, and this need for collaboration across multiple stakeholders. So really, the sector itself, again, fashion, clothing and apparel have been, in a sense, quite good about keeping themselves outside of a lot of the higher level sustainable product policy initiatives. But under the Circular Economy Action Plan of the European Commission, that is now starting to evolve into new discussions around a sustainable product policy, is now for the first time we've seen textiles coming as one of the value chains they're going to look at, and discussions emerging around fast fashion, and the challenges there about the sort of fast consumption. So, one of the other areas that is being discussed is this potential for so-called extended producer responsibility schemes for the sector. And we've seen those policy initiatives in electronics and vehicles and packaging. But this is a new issue for a new discussion for the sector. So in a sense, if an extended EPR scheme came into the sector, effectively would make producers and those that place products on the market responsible to take back and recycle, and potentially put in schemes for reuse of products. Now, one of the complexities of that is that would also bring in the retailers who would also in that way be defined as people who place a product on the market, because they may have their brand name in the labels on the product. So it would also bring in, you know, in a sense, black label products, or, you know, products that are produced en masse, whereby then, you know, the retailer may add its name, as well as, of course, the major brands. So in terms of this policy area, market transformation and collaboration, you know, one of the other issues is this, what other issue, you know, aspect I found, look at the sector, was very, very fragmented. Many initiatives going on, covering, you know, different topics and different sort of codes of conduct, and how are these often codes of conduct that are based on self-regulation, you know, how are they regulated in the sector? So, and again, bringing in thinking from other sectors, what should policymakers be doing to basically, you know, learn from other sectors in terms of how policy tools have stimulated and rewarded the leaders, but also tried to improve the performance of laggards and remove the very bad performing companies from the market. I mean, of course, within this sector, it's very complicated because of those complex global supply networks. And I think the other areas that we really came out very strongly was this need for collaborative leadership, or multi-sectorial leadership, trying to bring different stakeholders together to take issues forward. Easier to say than to do it, but to actually enable change to happen, there's going to need to be new forums to take that thinking forward. Sixth area, so demand, consumers, social influencers and users. So, you know, maybe, and I don't have a specific date for this, but what emerged was maybe that fast fashion started to emerge in the 80s, driven by a number of major brands. And really this is now starting to come under the policy spotlight, as I mentioned, by the European Commission. It's stated in the Circular Economy Action Plan, you know, the action to be taken around fast fashion. What that means is another issue, but also come into the spotlight for NGOs. And I think another key issue related to this sort of demand side is this whole change in the marketplace, where we're seeing bricks and mortar retailers really closing because of the pandemic, and even some of the platform brands, you know, buying some of the physical brands' names and IP, but not wanting bricks and mortar. So we're seeing this sort of rise of the e-retailers and the other place. There's a question there, again, taking from other sectors, is what role do retailers, and let's call them e-retailers, have in so-called choice editing? You know, just choosing the best performing, most sustainable clothing, textiles and apparel. They have an opportunity to place products on the market, and should they have a role to actually, you know, put the best products on the market? What also sort of emerged from this discussions was really quite an interesting point I thought about, really how rudimentary some of the quantitative forecasting that happens in the sector, and really the lack of good quality data often to forecast, you know, demand in a sense, and so a lot of when the term forecasting is used, it's much often more qualitative and about trends. So this lack of robust data and data in the sense in the public domain may be one of the reasons why we're seeing these very large overproduction, you know, happening, you know, and stuff going straight to waste. So in many ways, you know, despite the sector presenting itself as very consumer orientated, it actually may be very production orientated, in the sense that a lot of units produced, but within that, supply often greater than demand in many areas. So I think there was also issues there in terms of the really power of these social influences in influencing fast fashion. The sort of fairly shocking statistics from one of the presenters around the level of in a sense people metaphorically buying clothes for show on social media, and then after the first use simply returning it to the retailer or the e-retailer, that then maybe be going straight to waste. So that's sort of the challenge and the interconnection there with the social the social influences and the sort of the power of social media there. So I think other aspects that broadly within this area was, what would the wardrobes of the future look like? Would they include both new items, repaired items, maybe with visible and invisible mends, swapped items, maybe rented items, and maybe, we even, more broadly define a wardrobe that might also include virtual clothes as well. And there was something in this sort of discussion area also about, educating users in the care of clothes to extend the life of clothes, through online videos, basically providing people information about how to repair, how to modify, or even how to upcycle products or clothing. And there was even some discussion around, the use of potential into the future, the use of QR tags, maybe to provide more information on on those items in terms of maybe the composition of the items, going beyond what's on the label. Other area that came out again very strongly was this whole issue around culture, indigenous and ethnic communities, and really the importance of this area, and perhaps it's less discussed. So, in many cultures that, there is a strong tradition of producing high quality items, clothing and apparel that is shared within families or even shared within communities, and actually is designed to be passed through the generations, to be repaired, to be modified, and to have a very extended life cycle. And we also saw some of these issues in certain cultures, and the example of Bahrain that was giving, where there's a strong, mall culture with very, driven, in a sense, social media, fast fashion, but on the other sector, on the other side of it, a very strong tailoring culture, very traditional culture, where, garments are, repaired or adjusted, or you have, clothes, designed for you in that sense. And really going back into the indigenous culture aspects, it's this sort of slower consumption, more localized production consumption, and often the clothing produced from fibers or from vegetation that produces dyes from those local areas, and often on this idea of the unrepresented voices. So there's this cultural dimension very important, but there's sort of indigenous communities not included in the discussions around clothing, fashion, and apparel. And I think there was also something there around indigenous, well, not indigenous cultures, but also the diaspora from Africa, India, Asia, living in the Western world, and the sort of cultural issues associated with that. And there was an example from the US, which was quite interesting there, that within the Afro-Caribbean community, an example was given that a lot of sustainable fashion clothing was seen as boring. It's quite grey, it's not colourful enough. And that sort of linked back into some conversations about colour, you know, and how could you bring in more colour into sustainable fashion. But also, again, you know, that cultural dimension, colour is important, and if there's not any colour there, you know, in that sense, it's seen as quite boring and something that won't be bought more. So linked into this a little bit was also some discussion around regional and local dimensions, and clearly this was from multiple angles, in the sense of, if we're going to, within the broader sustainability discussion, if we're going to develop more circular systems, you know, that regional dimension is going to be more important, whether that is clothing, you know, made from fibers from a region, or with dyes or whatever from a region, and consumed in the region, or it's from mass-produced items that come to the end of life in that region, and then how you set up the systems for repair, you know, for upcycling and eventually materials recycling. And a very interesting example of the Dutch circular textile valley was given, where the Dutch are really developing a whole approach to looking at this at a much more regional level. There was also the discussion about, from a legal point of view, this idea of geographical indicators, where you could protect, and you've seen examples of some regions protecting the uniqueness of in a sense, assets from the region. So, for example, Harris Tweed, so that, you know, that brand is protected, you know, legally, you know, in the sense of the textile fibers and approach from that part of Scotland. But of course, you know, there is also, as we're seeing this broader sustainability discussion, you know, we're dealing with both in the clothing and textile sector, you know, both synthetics, but also bio-based fibers. But of course, on the bio-based fibers side, you've got a broader issue. If one started to grow fibers at a local level for clothing, there's the issue of the land use and those tricky issues over land for food versus land for other uses. But I think that sort of discussion is going to grow more. I think another aspect of the regional and local dimensions is we already see regional eco-labels across the world. For example, if we go in the UK, in the local area here, we've got the New Forest, which is part of Hampshire. And in a sense, there is a local eco-label for that region that's, you know, covers both craft items, maybe clothing. And that's very much linked to the tourism sector. So there's a sort of that aspect to, you know, the discussion as well. So the next issue was reincarnation and upcycling. So there's perhaps, you know, an opportunity to further explore how we move those inactive end of first use clothing items that are sitting in wardrobes to develop a more active second life through, for example, through upcycling or repair or modification. And that goes back into perhaps, you know, people becoming more aware about what they can do, you know, how to do, you know, a visible mend, you know, how one could, you know, provide a garment that might go into an upcycling process, for example. So, and we had an interesting example there at the end of one of the presentations. So actually the last presentation for a very interesting and useful presentation around data around waste in the sector, particularly production waste from Bangladeshi factories, is the the presenter, I don't know if he's on the call, then introduced his new upcycled brand that he'd launched. And this was really upcycling production offcut waste from jeans manufacture into clothing. And he displayed, he started to sort of model this in Bangladesh, so he reported. But people in Bangladesh saw him wearing these upcycled items as he's somebody from the street. He can't afford a proper nice First Life clothing. So really, it emphasized to him that was more of a market in the north, the metaphorical north, but also what emerged, I think, from other presentations is that how that upcycled items can be seen often by certain parts of the older generation as being not a particularly attractive item there. So this aspect of really upcycled items now being seen more as a sort of a millennial type of product, but a lot of interest. What we also saw there was perhaps in terms of upcycling and extending the life of products, the idea of the reincarnation is this example of providing videos and evidence and exhibitions, for example, and tools showing people how to do this. Maybe also people getting more involved in things like repair cafes and learning things in repair cafes or attending repair cafes and consulting with the repairers, for example. So, but also again, this issue of, educating people about how to care for their items to extend the life. We also got, discussions emerging around innovation, smartness and digital. So an example from, that larger companies starting to incentivize maybe the business units that they might only get the managing directors of those business units might only get their bonuses if they started to produce more sustainable items. So it's how you hardwire this into the incentive systems in large organizations, and certainly you've seen that approach used in other sectors. Now, I think there were some indications that Kering was starting to think along those lines because they needed to get pulled through, coming through the organization. But also there was, some discussion around how you could set up more innovative and radical partnerships between large organizations and other players to start to pull through, sustainable innovation in the sector. Another note linked to this was that to actually pull through particularly innovation in the technologies, it's not going to happen overnight. So there's going to need to be, more and more testing of the different types of so-called Industry 4.0 technologies, that might be used in the sector, machine learning, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, immersive technologies, etc. So, but again, once you go back also then to the production side, perhaps much less implementation of these technologies than one would have thought from some of the discussions. But also what we're starting to see in some of these sort of technology discussions, that again have come out of the pandemic, for example, related to streaming of content, is the quite significant issues associated with energy use and CO2 emissions that are often very invisible. And, so this may become a growing issue as we start to see, more of the use of virtual fashion and the various rendering technologies that, for example, maybe coming from even from gaming and things like this that require, huge amount of processing and therefore huge amounts of energy and CO2. So sort of linked to that, you know, this sort of growth of online virtual fashion and potential immersive technologies. So again, linking into previous discussion, you know, the launch of multiple reuse type of platforms, you know, certainly in the UK, and I know we've got people from various countries. You've got Depop is one of those that was mentioned. There's also Vinted and others, which is really trying to move that wardrobe. So there's the increase in the number of you know, these types of platforms. You've got a growth of specialist online videos and communities about making, modifying, and repairing items from an environmental perspective, but also from a sizing perspective, you know, which came out quite strongly. There was some sort of very interesting example from Ghana of the use of virtual fashion, you know, the use of avatars to showcase a number of circular designs in Ghana, and how they adapt. They wanted to do a runway, you know, of the various sustainable circular fashion items, but because of the pandemic, they couldn't do that. So they then led them to looking at, could they do this sort of virtual fashion show? And again, what then emerged with the technical company and the designers is the designers was a little bit skeptical initially, but once they saw the technology in Ghana and other parts of West Africa, there was a lot of enthusiasm there. So that issue of the world starting to sort of level up with the technology. This isn't just a first world issue. These technologies are diffusing. And I think in another area there that, you know, started to emerge, thinking about one of the other areas that I'll just come into is, could we use immersive technologies to actually get into the world behind the brand, you know, that we could metaphorically start to talk to production workers or interact and see the lives of production workers, so that we can go beyond the physical item in terms of that wider story, you know, in terms of clothing and fashion. Linked to that, a whole discussion around data, transparency and traceability. You know, thinking about global supply chains, you know, the challenge of trying to access good quality social and environmental data, and then how we exchange that data and how we retrieve that data from multiple stakeholders, you know, in different data formats, and whether certain suppliers, because they may have more power, are going to release that data. So, you know, and particularly if we start to look at some of the technologies like blockchain and whatever, you know, that there will be, you know, there is the sort of development of the algorithms to start to utilize that data when the data is good enough. So it's how we produce good quality data sets. Also, the issue there of growing critical consumers that are requesting more transparency, and how that may lead to more traceability, the need for more traceability. And this then goes back down to, you know, getting good data, blockchain, etc. And particularly see since the conference, you know, the whole issues around the cotton, the Uyghurs and the cotton in the northwest of China, and really how could you trace whether you have, you know, Uyghur cotton in your supply chain, you know. And there's many lessons to learn from things that really blew up in the past, like in Europe, the horse meat scandal, where suddenly at a period of time, for a variety of reasons, horse meat was found in beef burgers and whatever. And this was a sort of a combination of misrepresentation, fraud, and health concerns. So, you know, that whole issue, if you like, of contamination of supply chains from suppliers that use, you know, bad environmental performance or poor social practices, you know, may be driven, the need to tackle that may be driven forward by you know, the drive for transparency. We saw the examples of, To Be Frank, you know, putting out their whole business model on that, and also Mud Jeans really bringing in, and opening up parts of their supply chain. So within this sector, compared to other sectors like electronics or automotive, this sector really is a very much a materials-based sector. So a lot of the key environmental impacts, you know, certainly in a life cycle basis, are in the raw material stage. But again, you know, it's not just there; it's also like at the end of life because of the lack of circularity in the sector. So what had some very broad figures here that 60% of the fibers, you know, in clothing, fashion and apparel really are still synthetic, are petroleum-based fibers, 40% being non-petroleum based, which include natural fibers. So the whole issue of, for example, chemical recycling becomes of growing importance if we're going to look at extended producer responsibility schemes, how we're going to utilize the value in materials, components, and items, for example. But some of the issues around the chemical recycling are perhaps less transparent. Energy use, quite intense energy use, but also water pollution, for example. And we're already seeing that area in another subsector. I've been doing work in terms of, for example, the fishing net sector, where Aquafil have developed this brand called EcoNile that's using nylon that is de and repolymerized into a second and sort of nth life fiber, and they use a chemical recycling process. But not very much is talked about that. But it is a key issue. If we're going to drive more circularity in the sector, you know, we have to look at, you know, this. I think the other key issue that we see here is that, of course, many products are mixed materials, and they may include a range of different materials. And again, using my EcoNile example there, we've got an example of something called Healthy Seas socks, and these include elastomer, organic cotton, and also EcoNile. So on one level, it's sort of these socks are moving in the right direction, but then you've got, you know, challenges around how you separate the materials at the end of life. So you've got, you know, how do we redesign our processes, our design processes for separability? So how do we separate the materials to reuse those materials in different forms? We've also got other issues emerging in the sector, the whole growth of discussion around vegan leather, you know, using pineapple fibers or cactus fibers, or you know, a variety of other fibers. But in many ways, these are not more circular. Yes, they are vegan because they're not using animal, but they're not more circular because, again, they're using polymers to bind the materials. It's quite difficult at the end of life to deal with those vegan leathers. And I think, again, this whole mixed material, you know, may get even more complicated as we see more wearable technologies, see more integration of electronics and you know, sensors into clothing. So again, unless you design those wearables for disassembly, you've got, you know, essentially clothing, you know, and electronics straight to landfill. Biomaterials. So again, there's these discussions around looking at biomaterial development and you know, how can we produce using biotechnology, maybe in the technicals field outside of the food sector. You know, how could we, you know, produce new types of fibers? How could we, you know, produce new types of dyes? But again, this is absolutely not a magic bullet because of the various, you know, issues associated with the disposal of the microorganisms that might be used, the safe disposal of those microorganisms that may be used as a sort of catalyst in the process. You've then got those broader issues of land for growing fibers versus, you know, land for food. But then you've got another issue that we sort of didn't really get into, is could you actually produce, you know, some sort of biopolymers from food waste, for example? You know, and then you've not got those issues of land there. You've got this huge issue with food waste, particularly in the north, but what could you do with, you know, that? There was also this other more technical presentation around a life cycle analysis study on a bio-based fiber versus a petroleum-based, bio-based polymer versus a petroleum-based polyester, bio-based polyester versus a petroleum-based polyester. And again, they highlighted in that study, you know, that the petroleum-based polyester might not necessarily, from a life cycle perspective, be, you know, as you know, the bio-based material might not necessarily be, as from a life cycle perspective, you know, significantly better than the petroleum-based. The other issue, however, in discussing, is that part of that is that in technically, and I'm not an LCA person, but I've learned this, you can set the parameters of the system. So they really only set the parameters of the system for that study as so-called cradle to gate. So that means from the cradle, from sourcing to the manufacturing. They didn't include the whole cradle to cradle, the whole, you know, after use phase. So again, that skewed their results as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, quite clearly, you know, some of these, some of the considerations are more complicated than maybe we would necessarily think on the surface. Whole issue of standards, greenwashing, and what I termed, or what I interpret as the new ugly came out. You know, this whole potential issue for bringing more circularity into the area of the need for new guidance standards around, for example, what circular textiles might be, new testing standards around, you know, decomposition of clothes and decommissioning of clothes, you know, composting of fabric. So a whole raft of new standards, and particularly also this lack of standards in the social dimension. Even going back to the earlier discussion, even a lack of agreement over the sort of terms. And that's a classical standards issue for, you know, coming up with terms and definitions. You know, this whole idea of products that are associated with poor environmental or social, you know, concerns, or they're found to be using, you know, improper practices, may be seen as the new ugly brands. You know, something that people don't want to be associated with, and they you know, so if they're tarnished in any way with stories, you know, there may well be, you know, big brand switching start to grow. And I think there was other links there to, you know, transparency and traceability there, and particularly if we see this growth in terms of the fifth green consumer wave, this driver for transparency, whether one's going to, and I think it is, we're going to need to see a tightening up of some of the product environmental claims that hold air around greenwashing. And just sort of moving to the end, I think what also came out very strongly is the new breed of sustainable entrepreneurs, the growth of B corporations in the sector, and you know, startups and other micro and smaller businesses where sustainability is a core part of the DNA of the business. You know, people want a good business, but absolutely the sustainability issues are a key part of that. And something here also evolving around interest in authenticity of brands, and the stories behind the development of the companies becoming more important as well. And perhaps again, in speculative terms, maybe we'll see another growth with people questioning purpose, etc., coming out of COVID, and whether we'll see the launch of a whole series of new companies in this sector. And I think for time, I'll just move very quickly through the last parts of the learnings here. You know, there's something also around, you know, the development of tools. And that often, if once one starts to think about the design side, whether it's the broader sustainable design tools associated with clothing, garment, or fashion, or more specifically around circularity, often those types of tools are too complicated for companies or small companies, particularly small companies who are wanting to, who don't have the specialist expertise. So there's a need for the mantra of simple but not simplistic tools that enable people to make better design decisions in terms of sustainability, or more specifically on circularity, but don't get into too much, complexity. So it's, to be solid but not complicated. And again, this whole broader issue of particularly, academia working with business, this need to build relationships over time. And the example given of perhaps sometimes, the CEO might bring in somebody, but the other staff might think, well, are these guys NGOs? They're trying to drive us to be sustainable. So the real need to make things adjusted to the business, and really this whole idea of building a relationship or a process to transfer the knowledge, and the fact that that in terms of impact in products, in terms of reducing environmental impact, so it may take time. Particularly, it's not likely to happen overnight. So this whole idea of building a relationship, and also moving to the ends, particularly in the education side, this example of a young person that was involved in a conference of confusion. They want to bring their interest and concerns of sustainability into the jobs in the future, but they're concerned whether the companies are really seriously adopting this, and how one can sort of balance or marry their personal concerns with the company concerns, and whether university educators should be taking a leadership to drive sustainability into curriculum for the future personnel that move into the sector, as whether there's a responsibility for educators to bring out some of those issues around ethics, some of those grey areas in the sector, like fair wages, working conditions, what is good, good and bad from an environmental, social and economic point of view, and how you balance some of those issues and trade-offs, and actually how you try and find win-wins is very important. So just in closing here, it's clearly, if we're thinking forward to say 2030, if we're going to get some of this more sustainable innovation happening by 2030, we've got to start some of these and fund a number of these new initiatives now. We can't just wait, but also we need to start to work on, the quick wins, what can be done quickly, and what stakeholders come together to make that happen, particularly as we're now seeing more policy concern in the sector, as we're starting to see maybe this new wave of consumer interest. I mean, one aspect that we didn't discuss was also the financial sector, particularly for the large transnationals. You're seeing growing concerns around, ESG, around environmental, social / sustainability issues and governance, and that's starting to feed its way into investment decisions. So for those companies that are not large, companies and brands in the sector not being serious about that, they might start to struggle with funding into the future. So of course, just in finishing here, it's a very complex area. We end where we start. We're involved in a wicked problem, and there are many challenges there. But it's how we bring these sort of multidisciplinary aspects together with new knowledge, and how we develop maybe those new stakeholder platforms governance where different groups are working together to sort of lead into the future. Particularly if we're going to try and reduce those environmental impacts, that huge waste in the sector, a lot of those sort of unknown unknowns around the social dimension that are hidden, that need to be sort of understood more. So time for any questions or thoughts?